Have you ever felt inspired? Maybe you saw somebody do something courageous, and you wanted to do it too. Maybe you heard a story of peacemaking, and you signed up for some form of alternative service. Maybe you had a friend or a mentor or somebody significant in your life cheer you on to do something that challenged you. And because of those words and actions, you were able to do something that you never thought was possible. Whatever it was, I'm sure it really got you going. It really got you thinking and living differently. Well, that's not unlike what happened with the writers of the Bible, especially when we look at the New Testament. There wasn't a Bible that just dropped down from heaven at their feet that they just copied out and said, "Here we go." They were inspired to tell a story. In Luke's case, he traveled near and far and collected many little stories. These stories didn't exactly come with a date stamp. They maybe had some ideas of how they fit. But they came in here and there. Kind of like how your top 5 scriptures have been coming into Jess. 1 or 2 here or there. As he said, there's still option to bring those. I should probably remember that as well. So in Luke's case, which our 2 parables come from today, he was faced with all these different stories and many more. And it was his job to put them in an order, to tell them in a way that made sense and that conveyed an important message, the message he felt inspired to share. The texts that you heard just a moment ago come from a part in the Gospel of Luke where Jesus is teaching and doing some radical things that people would not necessarily expect, and he was inviting others to join him. He wants to be especially provocative, so like you saw in those words that we just heard, Jesus used parables. Now, if you're attending my Parables Sunday or Bible study, you probably already know this, but I'll catch the rest of you up. Parables are stories that reflect everyday life and events, but they have a deeper meaning, or several deeper meanings. I described parables kind of like Shrek describes ogres. You peel off one layer and you find another layer below it, and you peel off another layer and there's more. But parables aren't like fables or moral stories. They're meant to challenge and inspire us as we think on them and we mull them over in our mind. They might seem like a fun story at first or just something normal that we'd hear in our everyday, but when we truly let them sink in, we start to discover in some of those deeper layers that it is challenging to the very core of who we are. And so each gospel writer takes stories and puts them together in a way that helps them tell a specific message. And so I figured if they can do it, I can too. So I took 2 parables that we don't always read together, but I think they connect in a series where Jesus is teaching on what it means to be generous and what it means to live in God's abundant kingdom. Asking the question, what do we do with abundance? Like we saw in the video, we can live with a perspective of scarcity, that there's not enough. Or we can live with a perspective that there is abundance and therefore be generous in giving what we have. So I brought together these 2 parables. This one parable about this man who builds bigger barns. The second is a parable where Jesus talks about the kingdom being like a mustard seed. So option 1, in response to the abundance we receive, is that we can build bigger barns. That's almost a tongue twister, so I try to be very careful when I say it. So this certain rich man, it says in the parable, experiences a bumper crop and then decides he needs to do something about that, because his barns, which probably weren't the nice big red barns that we experience today, might be more similar to this sort of person-made cave sort of look. He decided, I've got too much to fit in there, so I've got to tear that one down and build a bigger one, or maybe 2 or 3. He chooses to store the crops, to keep them for himself. Because as we see in the previous verses and the verses following, Jesus is teaching about the anxiety that we feel. The times when we feel like there's not enough or we're not enough. These things of scarcity. And our default response to that mindset is to hoard things. Much like this man who builds bigger barns. I just need to hold it and hold on to it so that I can have many years in which I can relax and eat and drink and be merry. Now, even though commentators will say that to eat and drink and be merry is an appropriate response to God's blessing, to hoard is not. We see a story in the Old Testament that might make us think that storing up is a good idea. Joseph in Egypt stores up grain for the people of Egypt and by extension all the people around, but the intent behind it was to store it up so that others could be blessed. What we may be expected to hear in this parable of storing it up to bless others, we don't hear. Instead, we hear that he is going to hold it for himself. And of course, as the parable goes on, we find out that he doesn't actually have a long life in front of him. But I think the quality that Jesus is warning about in this parable is this desire to hoard, to try to control for ourselves this sense of scarcity, even when there's all of this abundance before us. Then the second parable, option 2, plant the seed, a mustard seed parable. Now, you might be thinking, how does this really connect? Well, when I was thinking of what you might do with a mustard seed, there are some options. You grind it up, turn it into a nice Dijon mustard. Wouldn't be my preferred way, but I'm more of a ketchup guy. The parable of the mustard seed says, I'm not going to use this for myself. I'm going to plant this in the ground. Now, planting requires some trust. It requires using that seed in a different sort of way. Rather than holding on to it, it's a bit of a letting go. And while we do work on it, if it's in our garden, we try to, add some form of food for the plants. We give water. We hopefully clear the brush away so that they can receive sunlight. We still have to trust that what we put out will result in something worthwhile. And as I started to think about how things grow in my garden, and this year it was more weeds than anything else, things growing tend to disturb the soil around them. They consume the manure that they encounter and produce something useful. At the end of this parable, we see that birds can rest in the branches of this mustard tree. Now, whether or not this is the most accurate depiction of how mustard actually grows, I think in it we see that when we start to use, we start to bring what we have received into practice and into the world. It can produce something. It can bubble up, as we saw in the children's time demonstration. Change happens when we stop hoarding and we start realizing that out of God's abundance, we can use what we're given to create something new. So what is our abundance? Often when we talk about generosity and stewardship and abundance, we all get a little squeamish because we know the money talk is coming. But I want us to think a little beyond that, which is why we're calling it the Stewardship Forum and not the Finance Forum after the potluck. There's far more that we are called to do than just offer our money. In fact, in Romans, Paul talks about us offering ourselves as a living sacrifice. This doesn't mean that we throw ourselves in harm's way, but rather that we use our gifts and our talents and our abilities, these things that God gives us and gives us in abundance. When I look around this room, I can think of all the gifts and talents and abilities represented here. It's a wonderful thing. But sometimes we hoard. Sometimes we're like this rich man who builds bigger barns rather than like the person that plants the mustard seed in the ground. Now you may be thinking, cool, thanks Clayton for the guilt trip. But that's not what I want this to be. So I want to tell you a personal story. So for the first 20 or so years of my life, I think I was a lot like the guy that built bigger barns. I was filled with anxiety and fear. I lived in the head stories that I would hear that I'm not good enough, that I'm not cool enough, that I don't have what it takes. And though I had a family that supported me and cared for me and was willing to back me up on anything that I did, that anxiety often stopped me from using my gifts. I thought, if I spend all my time or my energy for other people, what will be left for me? Or I thought, if I put myself out there and I screw it all up, what is that going to mean? And so I very much held back. I held myself back. I hoarded to myself what I had. But then I had people speak into my life to talk about how I could share. Those that came beside me and behind me and pushed me out of my comfort zone. One of my pastors in a church that I attended in Saskatoon was trying to get me to preach for years. And I resisted. Because when I was in junior high and high school, I had gotten these assignments where I was supposed to give a presentation before the class. And I literally passed out in front of everyone. You know, how it close in, get darker and darker, and then on the floor. Those were rough days. And that first sermon, that was pretty rough too. I took a drink in the middle and spilled all over myself, which is part of the reason why I don't have water up here with me. But it did allow for a moment where I could say, oh, my drinking problem, and got a lot of attention. But it was in those moments where someone encouraged me. When my voice teachers encouraged me to stop singing only for myself and to sing out. When people would encourage me to step out. People asking me to teach. People asking me to share my gifts. That I was able to realize that there is something more. There's something more than this anxiety building up in me. And that there's something more to life. See, in those times of actually using my gifts, I felt like I finally had a purpose. I finally had a reason. I grew up with this, I knew what my life was going to look like until I was about 18 or 19, and then I had no idea. And I think part of that is because when I was 18, that's when I met Jesus for the first time. but I think it's also because I didn't know why I existed. Why am I here? It wasn't until I was able to live into and to explore the gifts that I had. And like I said, it was rough at first, but it could become something great. So as we go as a church, as we think of what is ahead for us, as we go into a potluck and then a stewardship forum, I encourage each of you to think about your life, your purpose, and what you have to offer. And in a moment, you'll have one opportunity to declare that offering. If you have your intention to give forms, there are baskets in the front sides here. Due to the extended stage, I thought it might be a little dangerous to kind of squeeze up there. So feel free to bring those to the baskets up front. But if you're not, I encourage you also to meditate on this idea of purpose and gifting. And as we come back together across the hall, thinking about our gifts, thinking about what God has given us, the abundance that is there, that we no longer get stuck in this idea of scarcity, but that we offer generously out of the abundance of God's grace and gifting in our lives. Amen.